interesting. We went from the ephemeral city, let's say of the Kumbh Mela, of which I've been in Allahabad, and I went last year, in 144th year. 5,000 years, but they're every 12 years. Okay, so, and then we went to William Curtis's analysis, which I found interesting, of the linear city. Let's say a kind of organizational pattern along networks and highways. But I'd like to actually begin with Rahul and say, what happened to the society of waste, mistakes, experimentation, failure, transgression, in a way which is part of humanity, of trial and error and leaving room for a kind of more democratic process? Maybe you can tie that in to the idea of the more formalistic route of organization, of modernist organization, of which I guess the 20th century was so plagued, which is the 20th century, Le Corbusier using a marker to determine which streets are commercial streets, which streets are fast streets, and predetermining how every block would work. So maybe, yes, is what happened to the idea that we leave more laissez-faire in the process of building the city and not over-determine through too much planning?
Are you referring to the case of Chandigarh or Chandigarh?
Chandigarh, and maybe the contrast with the ephemeral city of Kumbh Mela, which has an interesting combination between.
Well, I mean, the way I'd respond to that is just to simply say you need both. You need both, and I think what I found interesting about the Kumbh Mela was the fact that you could, I think, in a condensed period of time, given different contingencies, that seems to emerge because you have the planning, the structure, which is very robust. But within that, you have the incrementalism, the temporality, people bringing their own beliefs in the way things are organized. Every quarter is organized differently, and I think, of course, you have to bring some baselines of hygiene, health, safety, which can be introduced in the real city. But I mean, I think my short answer to you would be that I think you need both. And I think the challenge for us is to combine both. Now, to qualify that, the one thing I would add, and one has been thinking about this a lot, is that, you know, the question of time in planning and urban design becomes really critical. We don't have a language for it. We don't know how to make how that informs our design processes. And I think informality, the ephemeral, these new rubrics, so to speak, I think they're not, at least in my mind, about me saying that the Kumbh Mela is a solution for urbanism in India, but they are reminders about dimensions of planning that we forget. And I think what we can learn from the Kumbh Mela is the notion of time. That is, if in this case it's 55 days, you get 6 weeks to deploy. How do you deploy quickly? I mean, they're practical ideas. But in cities, and that's what I tried to show with Chandigarh, we judged it too soon. We judged it in 5 years. The press was full of how terrible city it was. The India survival kit till the 1980s said don't go to Chandigarh, for example. But cities take generations to evolve. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, is I think the point William made. And so I think the heart of this, besides many other important issues, I think one issue that I can learn from informality, from the ephemeral, is what does the imagination of time mean in planning?
But what a difficult thing, because it was Rahul himself who told me the idea of, in Ahmedabad, there's a famous square where in the morning the cows come in, the hay is laid out on the square. No, I think it, on the
square. Not the cows, but the market, yeah.
The market, yeah. And then later at 11, the market opens up, the cows are out, and then later in the afternoon, shopping goes on, and then it's a party square at night. So, but what a difficult thing for our planners to do time planning, and how would they now legislate for these multiple layers where streets could be used at different times in different ways?
No, so I think it comes to the question of over-prescription, which is what I was cautioning might be a problem with if you saw that video to the end, I mean, everything is prescribed, down to like the doorbell almost, I mean, short of the doorbell. So I think over-prescription is a problem, and I think in cultures like ours where culturally we use the temporal landscape with absolute ease. The question for urban design is how do you make the spaces for that? And it's possible to regulate it. Once you make it part of your imagination, the regulation is only a tool to regulate it. But it doesn't enter our lexicon, it doesn't enter our discussion, so you can't even start designing for it. Sorry.
Yes, well, I'd like to go a little bit further with that. I mean, most of the extraordinary cities in history are also about an idea of the city, their representation and symbolism. I mean, take Jaipur, which we all know, which is in fact a cosmograph with 9 squares, etc., etc., and with a very clear urban language of hierarchy between the secular and sacred, a disposition of streets, dealing with climate, sun angles, and what have you. So there's a grammar that's inserted into the geometry. If I may refer again to personal experience, I happen to live in a part of France where there's a series of bastide towns that were built in the 12th century, 13th century, which are generally with a very big square in the middle, with narrow streets, often a religious building that had walls in the past. This type is reproduced on different topographies with variations. It certainly doesn't frustrate our life to have this extremely strong structure. On a certain day there are markets, then there's a festival, then there's something else. In fact, I'd even say that a fairly sort of strong clarity to defining elements of the city is rather a good thing. Great flexibility can occur in behavior in that. I think there's a sort of worry about somehow making flexibility visible through form in some way. Well, why? I mean, why not make something rather clear as a hierarchy, and then within that many things happen and do happen over time. I mean, the way we use the Franche de Rouergue is not exactly the same that was used in 1281, nor in 1943 or any other time. So I think that the urban form is something which is neglected a great deal at the moment. I think that thinking about the component elements and how they could go together, which is not an issue of high form, it's actually an issue almost of grammatology of relations to a generic language with high points of intensity for religion, for the state, for this and that. That's the role of the monument traditionally. These are, I think, old questions. I don't think they've really gone away. But the issues are obviously to do with the overfill, the complete chaos along the periphery, which is true of all of these places. So is there a need for so-called order in this environment or not? And what is it that's really producing the generic types there? It's to do with commercialization of the landscape. And I dare say if one just stripped one's eyes away and analyzed absolutely analytically the form of the strip, let's say, outside Jaipur, the form of the strip outside a town in Arizona, and one outside China, we find unbelievably consistent things going on, which are to do with mercantile space, parking, access, such boards, etc. So, what one does with all that in terms of city, automobile city, or whatever, I'm not entirely sure, except that there are parks, there are green belts, there are lines, there are ways of handling the monumental through planting. There are ways of giving shade, fabric, and so on, through vegetation, through field patterns, through all the other things which involve in agriculture. Agriculture has its own ordering systems, which are perfectly common sense, to do with how big a field is, what orientation, the dikes, the this, the that. Now, these are all part of the hidden language of the landscape. And for me, a landscape is a mixture of the artificial and truly the natural. In France, we call a landscape which is let go a friche. It's regarded as something actually rather negative. So the interrelation between cultivation and culture, agriculture and culture, between the field, the platform, and eventually the agora, and then these are what interest me. Every city should be rethought as a landscape in a certain sense.
So there are two ideas that you've put, which I want to extend or put other ideas related to them on the table. One is the idea of the periphery and the problems of the periphery, and I think that's precisely why one was making an argument that the dots should become lines, which is, I think, something you've also highlighted. And I think what the research and the mapping is showing clearly, the amount of 5,000 people, settlements around these towns and cities, I mean, that could change completely the emergence of another landscape if they were dealt with differently in the way of the distribution of investment and attention, rather than letting them all morph into the periphery of these towns. And if you make the dots, the stronger you make the dot, the greater will be that corrosion on the periphery. So I think this is a complete shift that has to occur.
Well, I must say, your example of the riverbed with the instant town, what's striking is, first of all, they use a grid as an ordering device. Secondly, they have temporary monuments. I mean, they're not just old shacks and things. They actually are making symbolic things which are to do with rite and ritual. So it's an immense scenography of a temporary grammar for the city.
And a landscape.
But on a landscape. And a temporary, one that flows. So this, to me, actually reflects, by its very temporality, the fact that the people want to anchor those things as images tells me a lot about the need for those things.
The second idea was just the idea of the city, and I think I just want to put this for discussion as we open it up, is there's a structural problem in the way we've categorized and classified our cities. So it's the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, even though one is using that as the basis of illustrating this geography. But if you look at the criteria for the tier 1, it's the number of people, it's house allowance, government rent allowances. There are these sort of criteria which have nothing, it has to do with life in a very, very pragmatic sense, but not with life really. Which means, in a sense, just because you make criteria that's so generic, maybe in a democracy you don't have a choice, that you'll end up with a generic city. So if that taxonomy is sort of rethought, for example, in India we have something like 40 temple towns. Now I'm not arguing that they should be single-purpose cities, but every city has sometimes, well, to a size at least, has one or two functions that drive its raison d'etre in a sense. And those can also have a governance implication because they can become partners in the governance structure, which means that the visual representation for urban form will then vary and differ.
Let me step in there. So, Willie, you brought up this idea that nature is now capital, right? And so I want to refer to that. So we're doing highways, telecommunications, freeways, I guess rapid trains, but no one's discussing architecture. So in the 60s and 70s, there was a vision for cities that were built around the world, like Chandigarh, and the state took on a visionary role along with architects. But architects seem to not be in the conversation. Why?
But first of all, who is in the conversation? Let's talk about that. I mentioned international financiers, for example. We could talk about developers. Have you ever heard of them? They're racketeers of one form or another who do everything they can to extract as much money off a piece of land as they possibly can with the minimum outlay. Okay, so it's no surprise in those conditions that you get the kind of flimsy, imagey architecture that one is talking about. Not only that, you often don't actually have to build the building at all to achieve your ends financially because of image earring. If you study actually the way pre-crash, if you can call 2008 a crash, built up gradually, an extraordinary amount of it was to do with rapid capitalization on image earring projects, often with a star architect attached, but there was no intention of building it at all. But the leverage, if that's the correct word, put up the price of the land and the land and the land. And all around Paris, excusez-moi, il y a une opération qui s'appelle Unibail. It's been up to that. It's using it with a triangular job. I had something around when it's talking about the real reasons, etc. But in India, this is a very elaborate game that operates also on peripheries and all around. So as long as land is so much commodified, one has got a real problem. The architect has no value at all, except as a signature or an image maker who can help sell the project. Those are the value systems. So where's the architecture? It's image making, you understand? It's not going into anything substantial. So not only that, but the actual fabrication of the buildings is often given over to large contracts with huge construction firms who basically take over the package and design it according to their norms. And then they say, can you do some blue glass here, please, or whatever, okay, yes, I'll do it. No, I mean, I'm caricaturing, but not so much. I mean, this is unfortunately the way a lot of things have gone. So what does this do to the figure of the architect? Introduces the architecture of a relatively marginal position. Does it have to be so? I'm not competent to say, but I would say probably not. It doesn't have to be so. Does this require greater activism on the part of the architecture profession? Yes, without a doubt. Does it require more scrutiny from the citizens who are, possibly suffering from this? Without a doubt. But we're in a very, very strange world. And, Rahul showed a freestanding so-called smart city next to the Sabarmati. Let's be grateful it's there, not on the actual edge of Ahmedabad. That's even worse. I mean, in a way, the ghettoization of these things might be the best way to treat them. So they are over there, and they do what they do as hubs, and they don't interfere with anybody else, and no one interferes with them, at least not directly. I mean, this is throwing ideas around. But when they land in actual existing cities, you get London. London is being screwed up from top to bottom by very, very poor high-rise development. It's all about the capitalization of land. Not only that, it's about so-called making safeguards of the capital. The effect on this is that apartments are now going, I lived in Knightsbridge as a student in a room for £4 a week between 1969 and 1970 on a Kent County Council grant of £11 a week. I had enough to eat. I could take my girlfriend to 2 nice plays and maybe a concert. The same area in London I live in now, apartments in 3 rooms are going for £5.3 million. And they're in the same shabby terraced houses which are being tarted up, perhaps with a swimming pool in the basement or whatever. So we're dealing with this enormous concentration of capital in cities. Bombay is suffering from it too. What does this do to the normal life of not just the poor, but a student, a young person who has ambitions? The city is no longer theirs. It doesn't belong to them. Who does it belong to? It often belongs to someone who's completely absent, right? So we're in plutocracy versus democracy. That's what this is about.
Let me pass it to Rahul. Rahul, recently in an article, he said that we're trying to reconcile the fundamental values that make up good architecture with new form of patronage. So how do we reconcile those two things?
Well,
And do we have an example?
Well, I mean, there are many examples in history, but I think patronage is very critical, and I think Raj Rewal in Chandigarh brought this up fiercely, and he, made a very strong point about this. And that's why I was cautioning. I think the smart cities are very, very, very attractive to administrators because it quantifies things. It brings any risk of interpretation out of the equation. It's numbers, and it's numbers translating into form. Engineers can do that very well. They can give, a patron back of the envelope calculations, number of days, cents, people involved, number of cement bags, tonnage of steel. We often aren't as precise in that language. And so is that the fault of the profession? Are we not prepared? Or is it that we don't have administrators that are willing to take that risk, or the system doesn't allow it? This is a very complex question, but I think those are the problems. And I think patronage is critical, and patronage doesn't mean medieval style patronage. Patronage can mean, I think even in the 70s and 80s, there were a number of bureaucrats within the Indian government that I think facilitated fantastic projects for the state, etc. And that is becoming complicated. I don't know what the solution is. I would think that technology should actually help a level of transparency which allows that kind of patronage to flourish again, not the other way around. In the same way I feel technology should allow our habitat to become much more complex, almost with the organic kind of complexity that traditional habitats had, like Jaisalmer and things, rather than become simplistic, which is what they've become, little glass stars that are things. It's actually, in my mind, contradictory, because technology should help us build the complexities that make these habitats much more interesting, livable, equitable, etc. So technology can be deployed in different ways. Finally, it's the imagination and patronage that can instrumentalize technology in what we are seeming to imply a more productive way.
Absolutely. It's about putting the pieces together. The pieces are all out there. It's about putting them together in the intelligent and productive and civic manner. And that would include even the reinvention of the motor rickshaw based on electricity. So pollution level would go down enormously. Actually free electricity lines all the way along. I'm going to actually start drawing my linear city, because it's not just about trains, it's about all the connectivity, it's about water, it's about access to those things laterally, it's about them moving outwards. So we're talking about an intelligent infrastructure, like a tree perhaps, laid into a landscape which allows all kinds of interventions back and forth. And actually, in the history of urbanism, it's often these things that are decisive. Railways were absolutely decisive in the evolution of India, including its freedom movement eventually. The tube systems of communication in Paris were occupied the transmission of information for about 40 years. And so it goes on. The net in our time is an amazing instrument, obviously. But one does have to get down to physical issues. On the issue of patronage, there's very good people out there who want good buildings. Mr. Rahul is here. He's just completed an extraordinarily good building, which is in Rotterdam, which is the University of Visual Arts in 4 disciplines. And this was a visionary client who had and wanted the architect to do something very good. India is actually got several visionary clients who just would like to be diverted towards better architecture. And there's a little question of education and communication. That's partly the problem of the profession, to put itself in a better position.
So just to open up to the public, I would say that if, in a summary, if the city used to be the domain of the architect, like Chandigarh with Le Corbusier, now frankly, the politicians and the businessmen have made it their domain, and that transfer of authority has been achieved in a clever way by calling it smart cities. So, and by calling it smart, have these cities that are going to be built condemned to being stupid because the architect's no longer involved. Please, any questions from the audience?
Good evening, everyone. I'm architect.
Please stand up, introduce yourself, your name, and where you're from.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mohit Kumar, architect practicing in Delhi. My simple question would be regarding, are we not over-prescribing what a smart city should be? India is very dynamic. A smart Varanasi would be very different from smart New Delhi. What are the 2 or 3 key things that you think should be the basis of our thought towards a smart city, and then let the rest of the city evolve over the period of time?
I think Rahul has talked about placemaking. No, let him answer. Huh?
Take 3, 4 questions.
Oh, okay, different. Okay.
Go, please. We know that we have a population which is going to overtake China very soon, and we have 1/3 their land. So that's the second issue. And most of our land is fertile except for the mountains and the desert. So what is our solution in this context? Because it seems to look that we have to go high density. And if China has failed, then where are we going? That is the question.
So one more question and then go. I think in the back. Way in the back, at the last seat in the back, I think there's someone raising their hand. Yes? Last seat in the back.
Yeah, my question to Professor William. Do you refer to French, your colony or village? Don't you think India should have lakhs of smart villages than a smart city, few hundred? Because otherwise people will migrate again to cities. So it's not going to help anyone. So it should be the smart villages, maybe lakhs of villages, thousands of villages, instead of cities.
So I think we have 3 questions. Smart villages, and then high density. What do we do with density? How can we promote more sharing? And the first question over here was? Sorry?
See, different cities would have different requirements. A smart
Yes, the
Varanasi.
placemaking,
So how
yes,
is the context
placemaking.
relevant, and let the city evolve?
So I think you want to start with placemaking maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a fundamental. I'm sorry if it didn't come out clearly enough, but that was a fundamental point I made, that these are different cities, and I'm extending that to saying we should have taxonomies that are founded on the purpose of the city. We're not asking the question also of the purpose of the city. So once you clarify that, you begin to get architecture, because that's what, or urban form, because that's what urban form should respond to. So of course it can't be generic. I think, from what I understand from the National Institute of Urban Studies, I think here Jagan Shah heads it, he was part of our conference there. And these discussions were made, and they are trying at least to, in these nominations that have been made, they are asking for deep analysis, which means from that will probably surface all these questions, and there'll be some feedback loops, hopefully, And so I think within that, at least from what I'm understanding, they are trying to correct and respond to some of these criticisms. But I think the problem is deeper than that. Smart villages, 2 days ago, I raised exactly this question, why aren't we talking about smart villages? And Jagan Shah, again, I quote him, I'm not sure if he's here, he informed me that just 2 weeks ago, the government has now created a category for smart villages. But he said there's a big problem there because as they began to research it, they found that more and more the trend seems to be towards the hollowing out of the village, like in the Chinese model, because of the drag to the city. And he was saying that they're finding it very hard to do this. But the truth is that when we look at Europe and all the things that we admire as towns and settlements, the 1,500 person village or town that William lives in, they are all actually quite small. All the greatest cities that we celebrate in Europe are 100,000 people. The Italian model of urbanism is one like that, which is completely networked. And so I think it's a matter of a completely different imagination, and it can't be in isolation of 100 cities. It has to be, look at the entire landscape of urbanization.
Maybe density, do you want to say something on density?
Of China?
Yeah, I was saying that we have to go vertical because we're going to have...
No, but Jasmeer, I'm not sure that is the solution. And as you know, going high is not the only way to solve density. Sorry?
Yes, actually, I think one should be thinking about going down
Yeah.
too. Actually.
So China was another model. They set up these towns, and like I said, there are many cities in China, no Chinese cities now, because it's one model, and they have a big problem bringing people into these cities. So I think it has to be both. Is at least my view. It can't be one or the other.
Yeah. Now back to the village question, which interests me a great deal. This is partly a matter for the state, for the infrastructure, education, good roads, etc. But it's also a question of overflow economies from towns regularly. For example, where I live, yes, there's a lot of agricultural produce. 20 kilometers from where I live is Atier, who produces fine blades for turbo jet engines for Airbus. So there's a refined technology, but living in an almost rural circumstance. And I see no reason at all, given the nature of production for microchips, high technology, and so forth, why these cannot be placed quite far away, on condition that there is a very good infrastructure. And in France, there's an amazing infrastructure. So the circulation and infrastructure are absolutely critical in this issue of country and city and generating the wealth. Not only that, but it seems to me that in India, you basically have a nomadic work population at the lower end in the slums, that they're not living full-time in Bombay. They have remittances, they send back to their village, people come and go, cousin comes in, no one goes back. And I very much remember the construction system here in this country, in Delhi notably, even 30 years ago, maybe it's the same, when a quite major construction site, which was actually the National Institute of Immunology, where the people would come for 3 months, camp there, there were women and children, things were actually slightly laid on for them, and then when the harvest came, they disappeared. And so there's a great deal of nomadism in this system, and any good city must respect the nomad, must make wonderful places for the foreigner, the invited, and the nomad, and that includes the poor. So, this needs giving some dignity to the public spaces and places where people look at the words we use, squat, this, that, the other, they're kind of dirty words, right? Smart is clean, shiny, squat. No, there are ways of giving infrastructures, sort of Mela, maybe an Agora if you want to be grandiose. But, for exchange, I was looking 18 months ago at a model of Al Medina in Saudi Arabia, the way it was 50 years ago. I was on the jury for a new thing. And the person with me grew up there. And we were looking at this place, which no longer exists. In fact, the Great Mosque has now absorbed about 2/3 of it. But he said, I used to go with my grandfather. This was our house, past the Turkish castle, through here. I said, this is the open space. It's not just the open space. It's where the camels came and people slept next to the camels. They weren't allowed into the town, but we gave them everything they needed, the water, food, everything. Then we went down the street and ventured to the mosque and the Prophet's tomb. You see, I was fascinated by this. But of course, in the history of all towns, I've studied North African towns, in the pre-Sahara. It's the interrelation between the sedentary and the nomadic. That's a basic urban question at all times. It's just not been formulated that way. It's been talked about solely in terms of slums, etc., etc. So cheap mobility, ability to get back and forth, the wealth generated in the city to get back to the village through remittances, gadgets, objects, and vice versa. Now, another big point is about globalization, is that globalization can have a disastrous effect on agriculture because it forces it into monoculture. This is part of Indian history. One of the things that destroyed India's rural base was Manchester. Remember, cotton. And then eventually poppies and then all the things we know. Now, monoculture is basically a way of strapping the peasant into the global economy, telling him it's all marvelous. Yes, it's marvelous. He goes on his phone in Uttar Pradesh and he suddenly learns that the peanut prices in Africa are undercutting those in India. He's bankrupt in seconds. This is preposterous. This is absolutely preposterous. Before we even get going on Monsanto, and things, seeds that cannot reproduce. So one needs an agriculture that is self-sustaining, where people can feed themselves, but they don't have to go to pointless supermarkets and buy things in packages, which is where 30% of the cost goes, and yet they can produce some products of great quality, which they export to my linear system and exchange, which then go to a household in Bombay. Oh, where did you get those? Oh, they came actually from Karnataka, and they came this morning, and they came in. That's what I'm dreaming of, is much more fluid interaction between country and city.
So open up to more questions.
Just
Hello, can I be heard? As since I am from Chandigarh and William left at the question of looking at tree. So first I'd like to share an observation, or I'll share an experience of Chandigarh and the trees, and then I'll come to the question. So allow me to indulge. In Chandigarh, actually, when you enter from Delhi, from the Tribune, to separate the industrial area from the rest of the city, there are orchards of mangoes. There are planned orchards, and they're auctioned. They bear fruit. So there is a tree and the fruit and the money. Okay, number one. Now the question, you see, even with the best of planning, whether you will have Chandigarh or the smart city or whatever pocket of SCZ, anything, the real encounter or the conflict happens where whatever planned development you make, especially urban development, it goes and meets the periphery, where the periphery is, where it goes and meets the land beyond. That becomes gradually, territorial wars. The slums or whatever the migrants occupied illegally because they can't afford any money, and the rich get the change of land use act through the all kind of manipulations. That's where all the falling of process starts. And Chandigarh has not been able to find a solution in a free for all democracy. I think that's going to be a problem. So that's my question. What do you do with the periphery?
Very good. So the conflict and the tension between land and who's got it and who doesn't.
Wherever the built form meets the city or whatever meets the,
I think there's a where? Over here.
I'm Sakshi, and it's a pleasure to hear your remarks on and making us think more about how we, as architects, are doing to make a better environment around us. My question is that it's a two-part question. The first part being that in the face of capitalism and reference to the video that we saw for the gift city, what is, if not for capitalism, what is it that is the road for growth? If it's not capitalism. And the second question being that, I think I'll just stick to this one and be able to find my answers for this. Thank you.
Last question.
So conflict between land, who's got it, who doesn't, and is there another road besides capitalism? And the third one, yeah.
This is the
Gopal
last.
Swarup Architect. I am Gopal Swarup Architect. Actually, in the using all the like consultants for the smart cities of Delhi. Sorry, like smart cities of India. The IT companies are the consultants. What do you see the role of the architects and the planners in this scenario?
Could we take one more question here, please?
No, I think we take those three. The role of architects and planners, the conflict, and is there another way? Guys, what do you think?
I'm really equipped to answer the question about what we do instead of. Yeah. No, I think in your mind, what I'd like to do is to separate what you're morphing into one, which is capitalism, and then an architecture that goes with it. I think that's a question we can ask, because capitalism also, if let's say that, I'm not sure that's the right word for what we're doing here, but in our liberalized economy, it doesn't mean we have to take the images that come with this sort of thing as a given. So that's the challenge for us as architects. I think within capitalism, you could think of alternate imaginations, and I think this is the role of the architect. And of course, there have to be conditions for that, of patronage. Capital right now is very impatient because we are going through a phase in India of pure greed. Right now, when capital resides in foundations and institutions, it becomes more patient. That's the way capital becomes patient as it doesn't. So we have to reach that phase. We can maybe play a role through demonstrating in design paradigms how this can be accelerated. But that really then becomes the role for us. But even capitalism in its impatient form, and this is not the forum for me to go into that, but I think one can find architectural paradigms and typologies which can deal with both conditions.
Just want to add to that. I come from Venezuela. It was a mono producer of oil and petroleum in the 50s, the fastest growing city, and it grew a GDP unbelievable with $25,000 per capita. Per capita. And despite GDP growth, it grew in poverty. Because the problem is the growth for whom and where if it doesn't trickle down.
And so, I think partly our role, which is related to the role of architects, is also one of advocacy in a sense, to be able to challenge and resist that. And so I think the question of the periphery also comes from that. For me, I'm not a great fan of Chinese cities, but when I see those images of Shenzhen with downtowns and then going into rice fields, for me, those are really powerful images that you can have adjacencies like that. And so I think, and this is where the idea of typology, taxonomies, for us to imagine other ways of adjacencies, whether in linear formations and other, what can go together? How else can we rearrange these different parts is a design question. Right now, we are critical of the images we take for granted that come with capitalism, but the question is, the challenge for me at least, is how do you rework those images to take the best of both worlds in a sense, and can you some things you can't combine, some things you can combine. So I think it's a broader challenge.
I was some 30 years ago in Bangladesh and had a long conversation with the founder of Grameen Bank, who actually gave microloans to women to set up their businesses, partly as a social liberation. On the whole, it was successful, though he, of course, nailed through a plot of some kind. I was extremely intrigued by this. These are grandiose words, capitalism. I think we're all involved in the notion that we borrow some money to set up something, to do what we do, and in some sense or another, sell it so that we can earn our living. That's capitalism, I believe. The person who has a fruit tree and sells the things from it and so forth. On the other hand, as I said before, if one is too hooked into a money economy, a lot of that is unnecessary, and there are great losses all the way down the chain. So there needs to be a lot more thought about that. Equally, there needs to be a lot more thought about the things you pay for, like electricity. People produce their own things. I'm very much in favor of a sort of self-regulatory, small-scale model. The so-called globalized capitalism we're involved in is a power play. It's to do with, empire of various kinds, imposing models on other people, using violence and war too, constantly. What's been happening in Syria is not just about religion, it's actually also partly started as a class warfare. And the failure of the state to handle 3 million people who suffered from a drought, who are uprooted. Nobody talks about the kind of underlying causes of things. We're in a world of enormous violence at the moment. This is turning into also eventually a conflict over resources. Capitalism in the big global sense needs resources. It has to grab them if you can't have them, to prop up ways of life which are often highly problematic, very wasteful, and so on. But so what's needed is, of course, a critical reflection on capitalism. Centralized state socialism on the whole did not work, but there's a huge role for the state. And I would say in India, the state needs to be more involved, not less. It needs to be involved in mixed, you could say, public-private ventures, education, literacy, hygiene, infrastructure. These are still the fundamental problems in India. Some of these can actually come through private sector things when they're directed by a humane intention. But in the end, they are the question of the state. So we're back to the old problem of public wealth and private wealth. The word res publica was used very appropriately. This is about taxation, it's about redistribution, it's about projects of the state, but it's very much about education and literacy. There's nothing more impoverishing than illiteracy and ignorance.
So if I were just to conclude, because I think it's time now to continue this conversation informally, and then I'll pass on concluding remarks to both of you. I would say that we're hearing on the one hand a lack of vision at the political level, and we're also living at a lack of vision at the design level. So don't count ourselves out of this equation. It is about design. It's about explaining to the politicians, explaining to the new patrons the power of design and the different ways in which design can be interpreted. So maybe we need a new lexicon to explain the complexities of the city. And as Rose said, can we find a way in which agriculture and urbanization coexist? And I think we also have a lot of mythologies about densities and things that we all, maybe if we're a very learned crowd here, we actually understand that Paris is as dense as Tokyo, maybe, with its low pancake of housing, but very dense. So I think designers need to go back and rethink how they explain in a better and clearer sense exactly what we've been taught to do.
If that taxonomy is so rethought, for example, in India we have something like 40 temple towns. Now I'm not arguing that they should be single-purpose cities, but every city has sometimes, but to a size at least, has one or two functions that drive its raison d'etre in a sense. And those can also have a governance implication because they can become partners in the governance structure, which means that the visual representation for urban form will then vary and differ.
Let me step in there. So, William, you brought up this idea that nature is now capital, right? And so I want to refer to that. So we're doing highways, telecommunications, freeways, I guess rapid trains, but no one's discussing architecture. So in the 60s and 70s, there was a vision for cities that were built around the world, like Chandigarh, and the state took on a visionary role along with architects. But architects seem to not be in the conversation. Why?
But first of all, who is in the conversation? Let's talk about that. I mentioned international financiers, for example. We could talk about developers. Have you ever heard of them? They're racketeers of one form or another who do everything they can to extract as much money off a piece of land as they possibly can with the minimum outlay. Okay, so it's no surprise in those conditions that you get the kind of flimsy, imagey architecture that one is talking about. Not only that, you often don't actually have to build the building at all to achieve your ends financially because of image earring. If you study actually the way pre-crash, if you can call 2008 a crash, built up gradually, an extraordinary amount of it was to do with rapid capitalization on image earring projects, often with a star architect attached, but there was no intention of building it at all. But the leverage, if that's the correct word, put up the price of the land and the land and the land. And all around Paris, excusez-moi, il y a une opération qui s'appelle Unibail, has been up to that. It's using it with a triangular job. I had something around it when it's talking about the real reasons, etc. But in India, this is a very elaborate game. that operates also in peripheries and all around. So as long as land is so much commodified, one has got a real problem. The architect has no value at all, except as a signature or an image maker who can help sell the project. Those are the value systems. So where's the architecture? It's image making, you understand? It's not going into anything substantial. So not only that, but the actual fabrication of the buildings is often given over to large contracts with huge construction firms who basically take over the package and design it according to their norms. And then they say, can you do some blue glass here, please, or whatever, you know. And I say, okay, yes, I'll do it. No, I mean, I'm caricaturing, but not so much. I mean, this is unfortunately the way a lot of things have gone. So what does this do to the figure of the architect? Introduces the architecture of a relatively marginal position. Does it have to be so? I'm not competent to say, but I would say probably not. It doesn't have to be so. Does this require greater activism on the part of the architectural profession? Yes, without a doubt. Does it require more scrutiny from the citizens who are, possibly suffering from this? Without a doubt. But we're in a very, very strange world. And Rahul showed a freestanding so-called smart city next to the Subarmati. Let's be grateful it's there, not on the actual edge of Ahmedabad. That's even worse. I mean, in a way, the ghettoization of these things might be the best way to treat them. So they are over there, and they do what they do as hubs, and they don't interfere with anybody else, and no one interferes with them, at least not directly. I mean, this is throwing ideas around. But when they land in actual existing cities, you get London. London is being screwed up from top to bottom by very, very poor high-rise development. It's all about the capitalization of land. Not only that, it's about so-called making safeguards of the capital. The effect on this is that apartments are now going. I lived in Knightsbridge as a student in a room for £4 a week between 1969 and 1970, on a Kent County Council grant of £11 a week. I had enough to eat. I could take my girlfriend to 2 nice plays and maybe a concert. In the same area in London I live in now, apartments in 3 rooms are going for £5.3 million. And they're in the same shabby terraced houses which are being tarted up, perhaps with a swimming pool in the basement or whatever. So we're dealing with this enormous concentration of capital in cities. Bombay is suffering from it too. What does this do to the normal life of not just the poor, but a student, a young person who has ambitions? The city is no longer theirs. It doesn't belong to them. Who does it belong to? It often belongs to someone who's completely absent, right? So we're in plutocracy versus democracy. That's what this is about.
Let me pass it to Rahul. Rahul, recently in an article, he said that we're trying to reconcile the fundamental values that make up good architecture with new form of patronage. So how do we reconcile those two things?
Well,
And do we have an example?
Well, I mean, there are many examples in history, but I think patronage is very critical. And I think Raj Rewal in Chandigarh brought this up fiercely, and he, made a very strong point about this. And that's why I was cautioning. I think the smart cities are very, very, very attractive to administrators because it quantifies things. It brings any risk of interpretation out of the equation. It's numbers, and it's numbers translating into form. Engineers can do that very well. They can give, a patron back of the envelope calculations, number of days, cents, people involved, number of cement bags, tonnage of steel. We often aren't as precise in that language. And so is that the fault of the profession? Are we not prepared? Or is it that we don't have administrators that are willing to take that risk, or the system doesn't allow it? This is a very complex question, but I think those are the problems. And I think patronage is critical, and patronage doesn't mean medieval style patronage. Patronage can mean, I think even in the 70s and 80s, there were a number of bureaucrats within the Indian government that I think facilitated fantastic projects for the state, etc. And that is becoming complicated. I don't know what the solution is. I would think that technology should actually help the level of transparency, which allows that kind of patronage to flourish again, not the other way around. In the same way, I feel technology should allow our habitat to become much more complex, almost in the organic kind of complexity that traditional habitats have, like Jaisalmer and things, rather than become simplistic, which is what they've become, little glass stars that are things. It's actually, in my mind, contradictory, because technology should help us build the complexities that make these habitats much more interesting, livable, equitable, etc. So technology can be deployed in different ways. Finally, it's the imagination and patronage that can instrumentalize technology in what we are seeming to imply a more productive way.
Absolutely. It's about putting the pieces together. The pieces are all out there. It's about putting them together in the intelligent and productive and civic manner. And that would include even the reinvention of the motor rickshaw based on electricity.
So conflict between land, who's got it, who doesn't, and is there another road besides capitalism? And the third one, yeah.
I
This is the
am
last.
Gopal Swarup Architect. I am Gopal Swarup Architect. Actually, in the using all the like consultants for the smart cities of Delhi. Sorry, the like smart cities of India. The IT companies are the consultants. What do you see the role of the architects and the planners in this scenario?
Could we take one more question here, please?
No, I think we take those three. The role of architects and planners, the conflict, and is there another way? Guys, what do you think?
I'm really equipped to answer the question about what we do instead of. Yeah. No, I think in your mind, what I'd like to do is to separate what you're morphing into one, which is capitalism, and then an architecture that goes with it. I think that's a question we can ask, because capitalism also, if let's say that, I'm not sure that's the right word for what we're doing here, but in our liberalized economy, it doesn't mean we have to take the images that come with this sort of thing as a given. So that's the challenge for us as architects. I think within capitalism, you could think of alternate imaginations, and I think this is the role of the architect. And of course, there have to be conditions for that, of patronage. Capital right now is very impatient because we are going through a phase in India of pure greed. Right now, when capital resides in foundations and institutions, it becomes more patient. That's the way capital becomes patient as it doesn't. So we have to reach that phase. We can maybe play a role through demonstrating in design paradigms how this can be accelerated. But that really then becomes the role for us. But even capitalism in its impatient form, and this is not the forum for me to go into that, but I think one can find architectural paradigms and typologies which can deal with both conditions.
Just want to add to that. I come from Venezuela. It was a mono producer of oil and petroleum in the 50s, the fastest growing city, and it grew a GDP unbelievable with $25,000 per capita. Per capita. And despite GDP growth, it grew in poverty. Because the problem is the growth for whom and where if it doesn't trickle down.
And so, I think partly our role, which is related to the role of architects, is also one of advocacy in a sense to be able to challenge and resist that. And so I think the question of the periphery also comes from that. For me, I'm not a great fan of Chinese cities, but when I see those images of Shenzhen with downtowns and then going into rice fields, for me, those are really powerful images that you can have adjacencies like that. And so I think, and this is where the idea of typology, taxonomies, for us to imagine other ways of adjacencies, whether in linear formations and other, what can go together? How else can we rearrange these different parts is a design question. Right now, we are critical of the images we take for granted that come with capitalism, but the question is, the challenge for me at least, is how do you rework those images to take the best of both worlds in a sense, and can you some things you can't combine, some things you can combine. So I think it's a broader challenge.
I was some 30 years ago in Bangladesh and had a long conversation with the founder of Grameen Bank, who actually gave microloans to women to set up their businesses, partly as a social liberation. On the whole, it was successful, though he, of course, nailed through a plot of some kind. I was extremely intrigued by this. These are grandiose words, capitalism. I think we're all involved in the notion that we borrow some money to set up something, to do what we do, and in some sense or another, sell it so that we can earn our living. That's capitalism, I believe. The person who has a fruit tree and sells the things from it and so forth. On the other hand, as I said before, If one is too hooked into a money economy, a lot of that is unnecessary, and there are great losses all the way down the chain. So there needs to be a lot more thought about that. Equally, there needs to be a lot more thought about the things you pay for, like electricity. People produce their own things. I mean, I'm very much in favor of a sort of self-regulatory, small-scale partner. The so-called globalized capitalism involved in is a power play. It's to do with, empire of various kinds, imposing models on other people, using violence and war, too, constantly. What's been happening in Syria is not just about religion, it's actually also partly started as a class warfare. And the failure of the state to handle 3 million people who suffered from a drought, who are uprooted. Nobody talks about the kind of underlying causes of things. We're in a world of enormous violence at the moment. This is turning into also eventually a conflict over resources. Capitalism in the big global sense needs resources. It has to grab them if you can't have them, to prop up ways of life which are often highly problematic, very wasteful, and so on. But so what's needed is, of course, a critical reflection on capitalism. Centralized state socialism on the whole did not work, but there's a huge role for the state. And I would say in India, the state needs to be more involved and not less. It needs to be involved in mixed, you could say, public-private ventures, education, literacy, hygiene, infrastructure. These are still the fundamental problems in India. Some of these can actually come through private sector things when they're directed by a humane intention. But in the end, they are the question of the state. So we're back to the old problem of public wealth and private wealth. The word res publica was used very appropriately. This is about taxation, it's about redistribution, it's about projects of the state, but it's very much about education and literacy. There's nothing more impoverishing than illiteracy and ignorance.
So if I were just to conclude, because I think it's time now to continue this conversation informally, and then I'll pass on concluding remarks to both of you. I would say that we're hearing on the one hand a lack of vision at the political level, and we're also living at a lack of vision at the design level. So don't count ourselves out of this equation. It is about design. It's about explaining to the politicians, explaining to the new patrons the power of design and the different ways in which design can be interpreted. So maybe we need a new lexicon to explain the complexities of the city. And as Rose said, can we find a way in which agriculture and urbanization coexist? And I think we also have a lot of mythologies about densities and things that we all, maybe if we're a very learned crowd here, we actually understand that Paris is as dense as Tokyo, maybe, with its low pancake of housing, but very dense. So I think designers need to go back and rethink how they explain in a better and clearer sense exactly what we've been taught to do.
About society and about politics and about economics, and I think it was beautiful to see what can be done, what should be done, and I think we all have to become activists in many ways, responsible citizens in order to come to a better world. But this is a very big project. Obviously, we cannot do that tonight. Rome wasn't built in one day, and I hope we can continue these discussions. And a very big thanks to the three panelists here, William, Rahul, and Alfredo. I think they did a marvelous job, and we want to continue in this work. And as I told you, on the 6th of November, please come and see the exhibition on Chandigarh reopening at this day. Thank you very much, and again, a round of applause for our panel. Thank you.